My journey into the realm of architectural anomalies began with what I thought was a simple investigation into peculiar buildings. I never imagined I would uncover something as perplexing as giants. The initial scope of my research focused on the physical oddities of architecture. Doorways that seemed too tall, staircases that were oddly grand, and furniture that appeared excessively large for the average person. These were anomalies I had always noticed in old structures, but I never thought much of them beyond minor curiosities or exaggerated design choices. It seemed logical that these were simply artistic flourishes or ceremonial exaggerations, possibly designed to make a space feel more imposing, or perhaps to convey a certain grandeur. I dismissed them as something that could be filed away as decorative excess, a leftover from an era when designers felt free to let their imaginations run wild. But then, everything changed when I discovered the photographs. These were not paintings or artistic renderings, nor were they stories handed down through generations of folklore or myths. No, these were actual photographs from the mid to late 1800s, captured with technology that we assume would have been incapable of producing such convincing images at the time. These photographs, unlike anything I had seen before, showed human beings standing next to regular-sized people. But these were no ordinary humans. They were giants, individuals so tall their proportions seemed beyond belief, stretching beyond what could be possible by modern standards. At first, the images were so surreal that I questioned their authenticity. Could this really be the case? Were these simply poorly executed composites, a product of primitive photographic manipulation? But as I dug deeper, my doubts began to fade. The grain of the images matched, the lighting was consistent, and the shadows fell perfectly in place, suggesting they were indeed real photographs. These images were captured in an era before digital manipulation, at a time when photography was still in its infancy. They predated the technology we use today to digitally alter images with ease. It seemed impossible to argue that these photos were anything other than genuine depictions of real people, people of impossible size. Curious and determined, I began to explore further. I uncovered a range of photographs, carte de visite images from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s, and tintypes showing men and women standing 8 feet tall, sometimes even 10 feet tall. These weren't actors or circus performers who were deliberately promoted as such. They weren't showmen or entertainers traveling with a known agenda. These were regular people, photographed in formal settings, dressed in period-appropriate clothing, often surrounded by family members of normal size. It was as if they were captured for ordinary portraits, posing just like anyone else, but their immense size was undeniable. The British Museum archives contained several such photographs, while the Smithsonian made passing references to them, dismissing them as medical anomalies with little to no investigation into their authenticity. Similar images were found in French collections, and even Russian imperial records referenced individuals of unusual stature, serving in ceremonial roles. But the pattern was consistent. Each time these individuals were acknowledged, they were categorized and then moved on from without further examination. No one seemed particularly curious about them. No one thought to ask why they were so large or what role they played in society. These giants were simply written off as anomalies, their existence swept under the rug as something unimportant. Yet the questions remained: why were these individuals photographed at all? Why were they not viewed as freaks or anomalies, as was often the case for individuals with physical characteristics outside the norm? Why were they treated as normal members of society, holding positions of authority, working as overseers, guards, and even foremen of large construction projects? The photographs, so formal and dignified, suggested that these individuals were not considered unusual in their time, but rather they were respected members of the workforce, society's gatekeepers and leaders. What I found most curious was that many of these photographs showed these giants standing in front of buildings, massive, imposing structures, with doorways so oversized that they seemed more fitting for someone of their extraordinary size than for an ordinary human. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It was as if these buildings, so grand and intimidating, made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of a 9-foot-tall human. Buildings that would otherwise seem impractical for regular-sized people suddenly appeared to be precisely designed for these towering individuals. The realization struck me as I began to analyze the architectural details of various government buildings, estates, and historical sites. It became apparent that many of these structures, dating back to the 1700s and 1800s, featured doorways that were not just tall but excessive, sometimes measuring between 12 to 15 feet high, and these weren't just at entrances. They were located inside, in working corridors where there was no reason for grandeur. Staircases within these buildings were designed with risers so high that normal people would have to stretch just to climb them comfortably. And then there were the furniture pieces, desks, chairs, beds, and other household items found in estate sales and museums. These were all slightly too large for normal-sized individuals, leading historians and curators to dismiss them as custom-made for tall individuals or as eccentric design choices. This pattern wasn't confined to a single country or a particular type of architecture. It appeared across the world, from America's courthouses to Europe's administrative buildings, from Russia to India and South America. Government structures built during the same period consistently featured oversized proportions. Buildings supposedly designed for aesthetic reasons, but they made no sense unless the people who worked in them were of extraordinary size. All these elements came together, leading me to wonder, could it be that these structures were designed for these giants? Could the giants themselves have been the original architects and overseers of these monumental structures, their size not a physical anomaly but a functional trait? Was it possible that these buildings, designed with such strange proportions, were not the product of random artistic indulgence, but rather a reflection of the needs of an entire class of larger individuals? The deeper I dug, the more it became clear that this was not simply a case of coincidence. There was something larger, something that was systematically ignored and erased from history. And as I continued to uncover more photographic evidence, architectural anomalies, and references to giants in historical records, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. As I continued my exploration into the anomalies of architecture, the more unsettling my findings became. I had already uncovered evidence in photographs of giants, but now I began to examine the buildings themselves. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. Across different countries and continents, I found countless examples of oversized doorways, towering staircases, and excessively large furniture. These elements seemed impractical, even absurd, especially for the purpose of everyday use in working spaces. As I examined the architecture of government buildings, administrative offices, and public works from the 1700s and 1800s, the scale of these structures struck me as oddly disproportionate to the needs of average-sized humans. I started by taking measurements of various doorways. In some of the most prominent government buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries, I found doors that reached an astonishing 12 to 15 feet in height. These were not grand entrance doors, but doors located in working corridors, hallways where grandeur served no purpose other than to create an eerie, almost unreal atmosphere. These were functional spaces, not ceremonial ones. The excessive height seemed pointless unless the people who were using them were, quite literally, taller than average. Staircases offered another unsettling clue. I began documenting staircases with risers so high that an ordinary person would struggle to climb them comfortably. These stairs weren't just impractical, they seemed designed for someone with longer limbs, someone physically capable of stepping over the large risers without difficulty. I couldn't help but wonder, could these buildings have been designed for giants? The more I investigated, the more this theory began to make sense. But it wasn't just the doorways and staircases that raised questions. I also came across furniture found in estates, museums, and even in archives of government offices. The pieces were slightly too large, chairs with armrests that sat higher than normal, desks and tables that were built for someone who would tower above an average person. Museum curators and historians often dismissed these as decorative pieces, or as custom-made furniture for exceptionally tall individuals, but that explanation no longer seemed sufficient. Why would furniture, especially in administrative buildings, be built for a population that seemed to be an outlier? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the architectural designs weren't anomalies at all. They were a clear indication that the people who used these buildings were physically different from us. The strange part was that this pattern of oversized proportions appeared in administrative and governmental buildings around the world. In St. Petersburg, Russia, I found that administrative buildings from the 1700s featured 12-foot doors and back hallways where no decorative grandeur was necessary. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures were equipped with staircases that required enormous strides, impossible for an average person to navigate comfortably. Similarly, in Delhi, colonial-era government buildings, those supposedly constructed by British administrators, contained furniture so oversized that a 6-foot man would have felt like a child sitting at the desks or in the chairs. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that this wasn't a coincidence. These buildings weren't designed solely for aesthetic grandeur as was often claimed. It wasn't just about making a statement. It was about creating spaces that were scaled for a different kind of person, one whose physical presence required different proportions. Who were these buildings really designed for? The question lingered in my mind as I uncovered more and more examples of oversized architecture across the world. This realization led me to something even more disconcerting: the sudden disappearance of a vast region from historical maps. The area known as Tartaria or Tartary appeared on maps from the 1700s and early 1800s, and yet, by the mid-1800s, it vanished entirely. This wasn't a case of conquest or renaming. The entire region disappeared from atlases, encyclopedias, and historical records as if it had never existed at all. For years, scholars had dismissed Tartaria as an outdated or inaccurate term, a product of poor mapping and ignorance. But as I continued my investigation into the physical evidence of oversized proportions in architecture, a startling thought began to emerge. Could this territory, known as Tartaria, have been home to the very giants whose photographs I had uncovered? The architecture was too consistent across the world, too deliberate in its proportions. Whether in Russia, Central Asia, Mongolia, or parts of Europe, the buildings shared the same oversized features: massive stone structures, towering doorways, and large staircases. And yet, there were no verified construction records, no documentation of the techniques used to build these structures, nor any explanation of how such feats were possible given the technology of the time. How could such monumental feats of engineering have been accomplished without leaving behind any trace of who built them or how they managed to achieve such precision? As I dug further into the historical records, I discovered that Tartaria was not just a landmass marked on a map. It was a civilization, a society whose influence seemed to stretch across continents. Yet, as soon as it vanished from official maps and records, the architecture of the region remained. Massive, intricate buildings were left behind, built on a scale that seemed impossible for the people of that time to have constructed. These structures, which bore the hallmarks of advanced engineering, were designed for people whose size and strength could explain the construction and maintenance of such enormous buildings. This led me to a provocative theory. What if these giants weren't just anomalies or curiosities? What if they were the administrators, overseers, or guardians of Tartaria? What if the architectural wonders we see today were not created by the civilizations that later came to dominate these regions, but by a much older society that employed giants in the role of builders and caretakers of infrastructure? This theory would explain not only the strange architectural proportions but also the systematic erasure of Tartaria from the historical narrative. If a civilization built these massive structures, only to have its history erased from the collective memory, wouldn't the easiest way to bury that history be to erase the evidence of its people? The evidence I was uncovering was too consistent, too precise to ignore. The disappearance of Tartaria from historical records coincided with the sudden absence of these giant individuals from public view. As the knowledge of their existence faded, so too did the recognition of the monumental structures they had left behind. As my research deepened, I was confronted with an uncomfortable realization. The evidence I had uncovered regarding giants, their role in society, and their connection to architectural anomalies seemed to be systematically disappearing. It wasn't just the photographs that had been overlooked or disregarded. There was a broader pattern at play, one that stretched beyond a simple oversight. The more I examined the historical records, the more I realized that these giants, along with their civilization, had been erased from history. But what was even more disturbing was that this wasn't a case of active suppression. Instead, it seemed to be a passive erasure, a quiet rewriting of history where questions simply weren't asked, evidence wasn't examined, and the dots weren't connected because doing so led to conclusions that didn't fit the established narrative. The photographic evidence I had discovered, giants standing tall next to average-sized individuals, captured in formal portraits during the late 1800s, was not the only clue. There was also an unsettling pattern of newspaper reports that had chronicled the discovery of giant human skeletons. These were not isolated, sensationalized stories, but rather mainstream news reports, widely read and discussed. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, major newspapers such as the New York Times and the San Diego Union reported on the discovery of giant skeletons, often measuring between 7 and 12 feet tall. These discoveries were treated as legitimate newsworthy events, not as tabloid curiosities. And yet, despite these regular reports, there was an abrupt shift in the early 20th century. After around 1920, these stories ceased entirely. What had once been front-page news faded away, and no further discoveries were reported. What's more baffling is that many of these giant skeletons, once discovered, were sent to institutions such as the Smithsonian for further study. But when I attempted to trace these specimens, the records became increasingly elusive. The Smithsonian, which had previously accepted and documented these giant skeletons, now claimed that they no longer had any of them in their collection. According to their records, the specimens had been lost, misplaced, or destroyed during routine transfers. The story of these skeletons had vanished as well, despite the fact that numerous reports and photographs had once documented their existence. How could this happen? How could such significant finds, physical proof of an extraordinary chapter in human history, simply disappear? This wasn't just a matter of a few missing artifacts. It was a systematic erasure of a truth that threatened the accepted understanding of human history. The evidence wasn't actively suppressed in the way we might expect with conspiracy theories or government cover-ups. Instead, it was as though it had simply been quietly ignored and forgotten. The photographs, the architectural anomalies, the newspaper reports, all of it was brushed aside as unimportant, as if it had never been significant in the first place. Historical societies, museums, and academic institutions that should have been curious about these discoveries seemed content to dismiss them without further investigation. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. The discoveries of giant skeletons peaked in the late 1800s, the same period during which these giant individuals were photographed in formal settings, and the same period in which Tartaria, the mysterious civilization associated with these giants, vanished from historical records. The more I pieced together the timeline, the more I realized that something very deliberate had occurred. The sudden disappearance of Tartaria from the maps, the cessation of reports about giant human skeletons, the failure to investigate architectural anomalies, all of these things happened at the same time. It was as if a concerted effort was made to rewrite history, to remove any trace of a civilization that didn't fit within the current understanding of the world's past. But why would anyone want to erase the evidence of giants, of a lost civilization that had existed long before the ones we've been taught about? What was so threatening about the existence of these giants? It wasn't just their size, it was what their existence implied. If these giants were real, if they had once been part of a functioning society, it would force us to reconsider everything we know about human history. It would mean that our current understanding of civilization's progression, the story of how humanity rose from primitive beginnings to the complex world we know today, might be completely wrong. What if there had been a far more advanced civilization before the ones we know, one whose people were physically different from us, one that had built the extraordinary structures we still marvel at today? The disappearance of Tartaria was more than just a cartographic mystery. It was an attempt to eliminate a history that didn't fit the narrative. The buildings that remained, the architectural anomalies I had uncovered, were not just evidence of a forgotten society, they were a reminder of something that had been hidden, something that had been intentionally wiped from the historical record. The more I examined the structures, the towering doorways, the massive staircases, the oversized furniture, the more it became clear. These weren't just architectural oddities. They were signs of a society that once existed, a society where giants were not freaks, but ordinary people performing essential roles in governance, construction, and infrastructure. What disturbed me most, however, wasn't just the evidence itself. It was the fact that no one seemed to care. Academic institutions weren't questioning the missing skeletons. Museums weren't displaying the photographs. Historians weren't investigating the oversized proportions of these buildings. It was as if the entire academic world had agreed, without ever discussing it, that certain questions were simply not worth asking. When I pointed out these inconsistencies, I was met with indifference. The response was always the same: interesting but not significant. As if the evidence didn't matter, as if the unanswered questions weren't worth pursuing. It was as though the academic and historical communities had collectively decided that the truth wasn't worth finding. But the truth is there, hiding in plain sight. The photographs, the buildings, the reports of giant skeletons, they are all part of a larger puzzle, one that has been deliberately ignored and erased from our collective memory. The evidence persists, waiting for someone to connect the dots, to ask the questions that everyone else has decided are too dangerous to ask. The giants, the lost civilization of Tartaria, the strange architectural proportions, They all point to a forgotten chapter of human history, one that we've been taught to forget. But the evidence remains, preserved in photographs, in stone, in the forgotten corners of museums and archives. The question is, when will we stop ignoring it? When will we finally ask the questions that matter?